So good to be with you again.
Yes, nice to see you as well.
We had a chance to get to know each other a little bit last week, and Scott was gracious enough to introduce us to each other. And we were talking last week a bit about the growing through what you go through experience and what we've been architecting through our work at People Before Patients. And then you and I got to talking a lot about your caregiving experience
Mhm.
and how also that's now translated into your professional life. I'm happy to start there if you want. I'm also happy just to start into what's kind of curious right now in your experience across your life. What's top of mind, what's percolating around in the mind structure, or in your heart. Where would you want to start? Where do you want to begin?
Well, that's a deep, that's a deep start. That's a deep dive start.
We go
I
right
might,
into the deep end.
I might need to warm up to that one.
You want to do some calisthenics? We can do some calisthenics if you want.
Do some mind
Yeah,
calisthenics or something.
yeah, it's really, I mean, it's no, I appreciate that. Yeah, sometimes it's daunting to think that you could kind of begin anywhere. Um, or maybe there was something salient from our last conversation or something that kind of resonated or reverberated from that.
Well, there was actually. There was. That's perfect. So we talked about caregiving, and we talked about you brought up the fact that it's a very nuanced role that someone takes on and often very complicated. And that really got my mind to thinking about that role and what it entails and what the word actually means or doesn't mean to people. And so I've been working on a blog post about that. And so, yeah, that's been rolling around in my head since we had that conversation because um, when I started caring for my mother, and I tell people this all the time, I didn't consider myself her caregiver. She had just, my father and brother had died, and she was in some pretty serious grief. And she just needed somebody. She needed family. And she was fine. She was dry. I mean, she was totally fine. Physically, mentally, she was fine. She was just in grief, deep, deep grief, which I didn't really understand that either at the time. And I kept trying to pull her out of it, which I now know after going through some grief training, that's not what you do. But yeah, I thought about, when did I decide that I was her caregiver? And I didn't decide. Someone else told me that's what I was. They said, "You're a great caregiver to your mother." And I had to go home and think about that word because I really had never even heard it before, only in the terms or the framework or context of healthcare or a mother to a child or something like that, but never to an adult child to their parent. And it at that time, it gave me great pause for reflection on, well, gosh, what does that mean? And then I took it, I think I internalized it to be this huge responsibility, more than I really felt like I was doing. Because then I began thinking at the time, oh, I should be doing more.
Mm.
I should be doing this or that, or am I doing enough? Or am I doing this right? Or because all of a sudden there was a context for what I was doing that I didn't have before. And maybe I was better off without that context. I don't
I'd like to reject this context. Yeah. It's so interesting that you're saying this because, we talked about your experience with care and my experience with care and having worked professionally in the care space, and now you're working professionally in the care space. Care is it's this kind of slippery thing because it's hard to know where care begins and ends, which I think is why it's hard for a lot of caregivers to draw a line around their experience. So it's very common. I actually cannot think of an instance where someone, let's say, steps into a kind of caring role for someone else, and other than in a professional context, which
Right.
you're trained into
Hmm.
how to understand your role. So let's say, just say for the average person, a family or friend caregiver, none of them intuit being a caregiver. I've never seen that happen. I've never seen someone wake up and realize, oh, a loved one is not well. They're going to need my support. I'm a caregiver now. I've never seen that happen. And it's something about, it's probably about a lot of things, but I've come to feel that it's a lot about when it comes to care, when it comes to this kind of very natural, organic thing we call care. Um, the hardest thing to do is to put it into a box. Um, there's a I was attending this workshop recently, and someone gave this analogy. There's that part of The Little Prince. Have you read The Little Prince, the book?
Yeah, one of my favorite books.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's a part of that book where Little Prince asks, I forget who it is, to draw him a sheep.
Uh-huh.
And he doesn't seem to quite like the sheep that's being drawn for him. It's not the right sheep. And he keeps rejecting the drawings of the sheep. And eventually the illustrator just draws him a box with some holes in it and says, your sheep is in this box. And that's satisfying for the little prince. And I feel like caregiving is like a sheep in a box.
Huh.
It's a very hard thing to pin down. It's a very hard thing to draw the very explicit lines around it. We do, and we give it language and lots of research on it. And yet there's something in the experience of care that seems much more elusive, much more difficult to pin down, much more difficult to self-understand, which is why I think so many caregivers either don't intuit being a caregiver, or it's some of whom actually push back against that language. Like it doesn't seem to rest with them. And I think it's also, in a way, been a challenge to the caregiver movement
Hmm.
because they're trying to frame and put a language around this thing that, again, is very blurry. The lines are very blurry.
Well, and I think also the thing that I was reflecting on as I was trying to write this blog post is that there's a lot of history to it. I mean, thousands of years of family history, and it never had a term caregiver. When we lived as family units, or we lived within walking distance of our family members, we just assumed care of them when they needed it.
Yeah,
And it was what you did. It was family obligation, responsibility, or duty, or love.
right.
It's what you did. And when I think about how difficult it is to reach those caregivers in right now, it's really difficult to reach them. Um, and it's really harder to reach those that are in that sandwich generation, struggling with work and career and their own families and their aging parents. And they're just plugging along doing it. And it's even harder to get an employer to recognize that there's a need there to support them, like they learn to support families having children, but they haven't quite figured that out yet. Some have, but not many employers. And I think a lot of that is the historical role of care, in that women primarily assumed the role, responsibility, duty of caring for family members when it was needed to be done. And so it was women's work. Like, women assumed the primary responsibility of caring for children for many, many years. or quit their job so they could stay home and raise their children until a certain age. And, it wasn't until there was a big sort of revolution around childcare needs and women coming back to the workplace that companies realized, oh, we need to support these people. We're losing valuable employees. But with care of an adult, I'm going to just say adults in general, because many people are caring for a spouse, a partner, an adult child with some needs. There's not that recognition of, let's support this person. They are of value to us in so many ways, and they're struggling with this role of theirs that they're not even telling us they have,
I
because so
think,
many, as you said, caregivers don't identify with that term. They also don't identify themselves to other people as that.
yeah, and I also think that there's a danger in urging caregivers to understand. Like, I thought it was really interesting when you were sharing earlier, you said how in part when you when that term was brought to you, it also felt like you were being saddled with something.
Mm,
And I think we need to notice that.
mhm,
Something unusual happens, I notice, when caregivers, particularly in the healthcare system, start to understand themselves as caregivers. And what seems to happen is that they also become mired in the context that's called healthcare.
mhm,
In a way, they also start medicalizing their experience, or the lines around their experience start to become contained, which is both freeing and also confining.
mhm,
Um, I think it's the same reason why healthcare has struggled so much to see caregivers, because the language of healthcare, largely about diagnosis, largely
mhm.
about treatment. I don't know how you diagnose someone with caregiving. I'm sorry to say, Matt, you have caregiving. Caregiving, what is it?
Yeah.
Oh, let me run down the symptoms for you.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's been I think, a longstanding problem. And I think caregivers have something much more um, enlarging to bring to healthcare. I
Mhm.
think there's actually a danger in us turning caregiving over to healthcare. I
Oh,
think
absolutely.
I think caregiving is, in some ways, its gift to healthcare will be this restorative experience of re-intuiting care, and where care matters, and where care is woven into our DNA, like we are born to care, um, and where care actually reflects the best of us, and where care is so essential to our moment to moment experience with each other. I'm and so in some ways, I'm not interested in healthcare bringing caregiving into the fold, which seems to have been the thrust of the advocacy movement in caregiving. I think that's its Achilles heel. It's to think that somehow healthcare needs to welcome caregiving. I think caregiving is a much, much larger opportunity. And the invitation is actually for healthcare to see caregiving, is to see care. I think that's the bigger opportunity. Um, that's just been my sense of it, having worked in the space for so long and seen this struggle to push the boulder of caregiving up the healthcare hill. Um, yeah, just some things that came to mind as you were sharing.
Well, someone made a LinkedIn post a while back, and it said this was from a person who runs a caregiving support company. And the post stated that they felt caregiving should be defined as a chronic illness.
Mm. Yeah, see, that's a
And
very,
I like slapped back so hard.
yeah.
I like just totally slapped back because and my comment after I finished slapping was chronic means long term. Caregiving is temporary.
Yeah.
It is a temporary condition, if you want to. I don't even want to call it a condition. It is a temporary role, a temporary moment in somebody's life, and it is not chronic. And to label it as such, and their point was we could get health care benefits,
Yeah.
but to
This is
label it as such, you then box it in, and caregiving is so complex and nuanced. It's, as you said, you can't put it in a box.
Yeah, I think I want to try to find a way to state this so that it's well understood, because I could see how this conversation, or the vein of this conversation, could also infuriate some people. Does caregiving need to be recognized as a vital part of a caring process? 1,000,000%. Is it essential to our social structures, our filial structures, our healthcare? 1,000,000%. Do caregivers deserve to be supported financially, socially, with their own? 1,000,000%. But none of that means that we need to medicalize caregiving. None of that means that we would be better served by trying to jam caregiving into this messy thing called healthcare, which I would contend also doesn't fully understand health and healing in the largest sense.
Yeah,
So the danger is that, well, we want to be seen, and this is the system that exists. So let's cram caregiving into it, and let's start using a language for caregiving that healthcare can understand.
yeah,
I think the that's potentially a downward spiral. That's potentially a reductionist way of trying to make sense of care and caregiving at a time when healthcare needs more expansion, not more reductionism. So I agree with you. When I hear caregiving as a chronic disease, I feel like a round peg is trying to be jammed into a square hole, and it evokes a sense of tension in me. Um, because I think that analogy is so far away from, in all the tens of thousands of caregivers I've spoken to, what they actually intuit in their experience. I've never heard or never really felt sounds like, let's turn it into a chronic disease. But by the same token, I want to honor that person's experience, who they maybe experience it like it's a chronic disease. And that's part of the tapestry of this larger experience we call care. And that's welcome. But to generalize that and to say, yeah, we should find a way to medicalize caregiving so that the medical system, the healthcare system, can finally understand this. I sense that that's betraying the richness of this thing called caregiving.
yeah,
That's my sense of it.
yeah. I agree, and so I'm gonna circle back to your initial question: what's going on in my heart? And
We're warmed up.
because, yeah, I'm warmed up now. Because this is part of what's going on in my heart. So, I cared for my mother for over 6 years, and um, I shared with you when we talked last time about how difficult that year she died was for me. And I've entered into the professional arena of supporting and educating caregivers with a focus on those caring for aging parents. However, what I am finding now that I'm way deep into this, I should say, um, is that I have a struggle with how I want to do this. And it's multifaceted. It's, here's my experience. I know it's not yours.
Mm,
Here's what I've learned from my experience. I'd like to share that with you.
mm,
You might find some nuggets that are helpful. Here's what I've learned through some training about coaching and consulting with caregivers in a way that validates what they're feeling and going through. And here's my intellectual approach.
Yeah.
And so I often feel conflicted with the three of those parts of supporting caregivers. And I find myself often wanting to go deep into my heart
Hmm.
to share with them, to support them. And that requires me to extract from my own experiences. But to do that in a way that is not, here's what I know, you know, to do it in a way that feels like it truly is coming from heart and compassion. And it's helpful. Um, and then my natural sort of inclination is to become very intellectual about it, to go to my head.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's required when you're trying to educate someone about something. But I think with this particular topic, for me, I feel like I've got to somehow merge those three parts so that when I'm coming from head, there's still heart involved in that.
Yeah.
And when I'm coming from experience, there's still some head involved in that. And that's a difficult place for me to be in right now because I've been doing this for a couple of years, about 3 years now. Um, and I do struggle with that, Mark, because when I get to heart, I get really emotional. I mean, I can feel it coming up now. Um, when I get to head, it's because I've been reading research and white papers and statistics, and that's what some people need.
Hmm.
That's what some people, when they ask me to come and speak, want to hear the head part, the intellectual part.
Hmm.
However, I know from when I talk with people or when I do a live, uh, I do a monthly live conversation on Zoom that's free for caregivers. And I know or even when I do a social media post that comes from my heart, the response is a million times better.
Yeah. Yeah. You're bringing up the kind of age-old paradox of how do you um, hold the map while walking the territory?
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, there's that well-known saying, the map is not the territory. So
Mhm.
the methodology and the intellectual abstraction that we do about our experience is not the territory of our experience. In a way, the territory feels almost for many people more in the heart, more there's a kind of an intimacy in, like, we think of experience sometimes through the heart, through the felt experience, um, which is probably what the caregivers that you're connecting with are feeling in you as you move more into your heart. It's kind of where empathy grows, the sense of
Mhm.
intimacy grows. And then the mind steps out of the territory and writes maps and presents maps. And those are important too. It sounds like you're trying to figure out almost like a metaphor or a way of holding both the map and the territory of this experience and being and honoring both of those things because they're present in any caregiving experience. There is the territory of your experience in caregiving. There's those intimate moments. There's the grief, the joy, the breakthroughs, the setbacks, the moments of frustration with a healthcare worker, the moments of joy with a healthcare worker who shows an immense amount of care. There's all of those contours, right? This ebbing and flowing of your experience. And then there's also this wantingness to maybe be a little more oriented, being a bit more masterful at this thing called caregiving. Like, how do I get mom help? Or what could I do better for my son in terms of some kind of resource or some kind of support? Or where could I get a bit more help? There are these map type questions, this kind of index of how do I navigate this wilding world called care. And I don't know if you can have one without the other in a way. They're both seem quite important. So
Well, there are, huh?
what ecology, I guess what as you were talking, the question that came to me is like, what kind of ecology could hold both of those in a way that caregivers would feel enriched by honoring both the territory of their experience, to your point, which is very unique. Every step a caregiver takes is very different than someone else. And yet we can learn with and through each other in that. And then also this kind of navigational orientation, this mapping piece where, yeah, as much as it's hard to cast a net over this thing called caregiving, there are times where I wish like I could hold these bundles of squirming fish in a way where I didn't feel overwhelmed by it all.
Well, part of this challenge for me anyway also is that, and I think it's true of a lot of people that are doing what I'm doing right now, is the level of passion about doing it. I can sit here and read white papers all day long and gather up lots of statistics and information about what's going on out there. And it, in some ways it tends to incense me because it just um doesn't, I just strongly believe it doesn't need to be that way. Um for lots of reasons that I won't go into. But I agree there are the hard, which road do I turn left, do I turn right questions. I can't get my parents to allow me enough information to help them with their health care, and my father has vascular dementia.
Yeah.
How do I do that, Robin? Well, here's a suggestion.
Yeah.
Here's an idea for you to try. I'm not in your situation. I don't know your parents, but this is something you might try. And I can tell you this, by taking that right turn and gaining access to the health information will help you walk this path with your father.
Yeah.
Without it, you might fall off a cliff.
Yeah. And that's all care too, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
that's the ecosystem of the care that you are bringing. This, you have a sense that care is many things. It is seeking information. It is coping with the emotional impacts of watching a loved one sometimes decline. Um, that is the ecosystem we call care. It's all of those things. It's actually, the map is also the territory. It's a feature of the territory of the experience. Like they're all intricately woven. I mean, I think instinctively that you're turning towards the fullest, you're trying to hold the fullest understanding of care, which is a lifetime of work. That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
You're noticing that it is, oh, sometimes it is a map. Sometimes it is more that, getting down to the nitty gritty with people and being in the thick of that experience with them. That's all care.
Well, and all of those hard decisions, practical, but sometimes hard decisions that have a real intellectual component to them, have a huge emotional component. I don't think there's any part of caring for an individual that does not have the emotional component interwoven into it. And that's where it gets really challenging on my side to say, you can find some moments of joy, even though your parent has dementia. Because they're sitting there saying, I don't know what you're talking about. This is so hard.
Yeah.
And they don't even know me half the time. And, and I'm trying to say, but there are moments of joy in this experience that you're having. And trying to not necessarily convince them, but to help them shift their paradigm of what it is a little bit. And maybe that's at the core of it, Mark. Maybe that's the struggle, is that I feel like part of what I want to do is help these caregivers shift the paradigm of what it is that they're doing. And maybe I need to call them something other than caregivers. Maybe I need to call them um, people loving another individual. I don't know what the term is,
Yeah.
but now that we've given this term caregiver, I think some context in our world and it's become public more, uh, it and when it's my own experience, I said when someone said you're your mother's caregiver, and all of a sudden I felt a burden practically of responsibility and questioned everything I was doing. Maybe we need to reframe the paradigm of what it really means to be doing this.
It
You
sounds
know?
like that is very important to you. And it sounds like that, in a way, is one of the gifts of what you hope to bring, that you're enlarging the viewfinder through which we look at this thing called caregiving. That's, that's a gift. Because I don't know if you notice, but maybe if it's true to your experience or it's true to your experience with caregivers, the caregivers who are struggling are often feel like the ones who are backed into a corner.
Mhm,
Like they're living in a very small sliver of their lives.
mhm,
And it feels like there's no oxygen in the room.
mhm,
And there's a gift of being with them in the process of enlarging, making more space for ways that they can be in that experience, which to your point sometimes might be more strategic. And that's fine. That's again, that's a pathway in this thing we call care.
mhm,
And sometimes it can be just more heartfelt, like it's okay for you to be feeling guilty or for you to feeling resentful or for you like that's a part of this tapestry we call care. And
mhm,
that's enormous. And all of a sudden they start to notice that there is space for them to come back home to care differently. And
mhm.
that's an enormous gift. It sounds like all of that, this weaving of this experience, like you're kind of like the needle in a tapestry. And and, and you're helping to enlarge that to make all of those squares in the quilt count. Like that's to me the most I think I could ever in working in care in like 25 years is figuring that all of these facets of care count. And there is no perfect path. And there's no map that will ever point, you know, the perfect way through the territory of it because it is so wriggly and it is so unpredictable. And just knowing that as a caregiver is very liberating because many sit and think, I must be doing something wrong. I
Mhm,
must, and they're saddled with this idea that there must be some kind of leapfrog process that I just don't understand to get to the end of this thing or to resolve this thing. And just being saddled with that is can provoke lots of guilt and lots of shame. Um, and that's also in part a side effect of the medicalization of caregiving, because in the medical world, what do? We're looking for like the treatment path. There must be a path through this thing, and it moves us from A to B. And I've never noticed care to look anything like that.
mhm.
I think all of that is so it sounds very simple, but it also sounds like a very big gift in a very beautiful box with holes in it.
Well, it's the other part of this struggle is the level of passion that I feel for doing this because I've never had a passion in my life. And it's kind of interesting. I grew up with a father who was extremely passionate about his career. He was a world-renowned physicist
Mhm.
and made some amazing scientific discoveries. And um, he was passionate about his work, you know. And I always wanted that. I always thought that's what you have to have in life. You have to have that passion for your work. and I never had it. And I kind of stumbled around doing this thing or that thing. I mean, I did some great things. I'm proud of what I've done and accomplished, but I've never had that passionate drive that's deep inside of you, that's like, get out and do this, it's like a mission.
Yeah.
Until this happened to me.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean for this to become my next career business, but I really didn't set out for that to happen when I started caring for my mother. But here it is. And I am, quite frankly, it's a hard thing to do. But I am, quite frankly, unable to walk away from
Yeah.
the days that are hard. And I'm like, how come I can't get to those people? Why can't I get to those people? I want to get to those people. And I can't walk away from it. There's just like a pull that says you have a limited number of years left on this earth, and you need to, finish is the wrong word, but you need to make you, I don't know, I'm struggling for words, and I don't usually struggle for words, but and it's not that I want to have the impact. It's not me. That's ego. It's it's it is, how do I turn this around? How do I turn this experience that people have and are going to have, and more are going to have or are getting ready to have this experience? How do I turn this around into something that is no longer a burden? And it was a burden for me. I remember telling my brothers one time, I said, my mother always used to say, your father and I don't want to be a burden to you. Well, son of a gun, if my mother didn't become a burden to me. I mean, not always, but at times it did. It
Sure.
felt like a burden on my back. And I know it feels that way for so many caregivers. I know it. And I don't think you can eliminate that feeling because it's such a huge, huge undertaking. But how can I make this experience something that you'll look back on and say, wow, I got to do that.
Yeah.
I got to do that. Sorry.
Yeah. I feel in what you're saying how, I mean, it's clear to me that your experience with your mom was so deeply impactful for you. And there's such a natural wantingness, and so there's now this thing in you called care.
Yeah.
That you can feel it in you. You can see it in your face and you can hear it in your voice. The passion is the care. Like care woke up in you. Like it's super awake in you.
Mhm.
And it's so awake in you that you now want to extend all of this care to others who are also
Mhm.
caring. Oh, did we lose you?
Mhm.
Oh, you're back. You froze for a second.
No,
Uh,
I'm here. I'm here.
yeah, it's interesting being in a helping profession. I'm also in a helping profession, and I work with people who are in helping professions. And sometimes, when we're in a helping profession, we carry around this sense of a kind of burden. It's almost like a catcher in the rye burden, where we have a sense that we see, like in the book, these young people who metaphorically are about to walk off a cliff, and we're desperate to do anything to prevent that from happening. Like, would you want to see a caregiver ever have to suffer unnecessarily, or and there's that kind of deep wantingness to just remove that suffering, and in
Mhm.
particular to remove the suffering that you think can be removed, right? Like
Mhm.
there's the suffering that happens, and there's the suffering that sometimes we perpetuate through our own
Mhm.
um, unintended missteps. I feel that. I hear you when you say that. What I've noticed in my own experience is that that urge is in some way feels like my urge. I'm not sure if that's the thing that I'm doing or if it's somehow um, feels like some kind of odd expression of what I'm trying to do. Like the sense of saving. I can't save anyone from anything. I mean, A, I'm not qualified to do that. Um, B, would assume that somehow I'm very good at predicting the future, and even though I think that you're kind of running towards a cliff, um, sometimes it matters that you just run towards that cliff, or you jump off that cliff, or you fall off that cliff. And I'm not the manager of cliffs. Um, all I can really do is show up with a kind of caring spirit, which is to say, I've also run off cliffs. I know what it's like. I know what that ravine looks like. I'm probably going to jump off some other cliffs at some point in my life as well. Some which I will do volitionally, and some which I will just stumble into. Um, and there's something about making it okay to notice that this ebb and flow of our experience is natural, that there is no life that's lived on the mountaintops alone, right? Uh, and as a helper, we're not in the business of like helping people leap from one summit to the next.
Yeah.
I don't know that real version of reality, maybe in cartoons, but I don't know what that looks like. All I know is that there's going to be an ebb and flow. There's going to be those valleys that then invite new summits. And really, in some way, we're just trying to figure out how to navigate that. Like you could help a caregiver, and they're going to go through these ebbs and flows. Someone's going to get better, they're going to get worse. The relationship with their husband is going to feel better, then it's going to feel worse. It's going to be all of that. That's the territory of care. It is still very wobbly, and it's filled with ebbs and flows and ups and downs. Just holding that is amazing for people. What a relief to feel like it was interesting you were talking about guilt and oh sorry, you were talking about grief earlier. And you noted how initially where you were showing up to the grief was in one way, and then later, as you became more seasoned in this experience called grief, you showed up differently to it. And I kind of sense that in that second turning of your experience of grief, that something opened in you, that something was welcoming in you, right?
Well, I,
That's what you do. That in a way sounds like what you do is that it's you create the open field to make all of these moves of care more natural and rhythmic. And people stop feeling at odds with their experience. Oh, I shouldn't feel shame. I shouldn't feel that. Or I should be doing this and I should be doing that. And in a way, you give them permission to step outside of that and to step back into their experience. And when they do that, there's a different kind of mastery that shows up. And it's the mastery of moving with these tides.
well, I think in some ways you've just sort of coined a little bit of it by calling, and I've called it the experience as well. But what happens with us as caregivers is we are so wrapped up in the doing,
Mm.
which involves the worry, the guilt, sometimes the shame, the resentment, the anger, that we are outside of the actual experience, or the experience has become those other things,
Yes.
not the care and love that we are providing.
Yes.
And that, I think, thank you, is at the core of where I meet so many caregivers who are in the midst of it.
Yeah.
They're caught in that vortex.
Yeah.
circling the drain, and they cannot get out of it, and they feel lost and hopeless, and they're physically and mentally worn down, and they've lost complete sight of this experience that they're having, which you may recall, I think the last time we talked, I was talking with a caregiver, and I said to her, I said, "You are having an amazing experience." And she looked at me, we were on a Zoom call. She said, "Why do you say that word, amazing?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Because you're the only one that gets to have this experience. You're caring for this person. Nobody else gets to have this experience but you. And therefore, it is amazing because there are parts of it that, if you allow it, will touch you, will touch depths of you that are untouched until now."
Yeah.
And she looked at me and she said, "I guess it is an amazing experience."
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think that's when I say I want to shift their paradigm, because if I can get them out of the vortex, if I can, I'm not trying to save anybody, Mark. I'm beyond trying to save people. And there are caregivers I have turned away because they're so immersed in their victim status, and they're so sucked into being the victim of this role that they really have the barriers so hard up against them that help can't get in the door.
Mm.
um, and it's in their language, it's in their body language, it's in everything. And I don't turn them away initially, but I'll have several conversations and I realize, just you call me back when you're ready
Yeah.
because I can't help you right now.
And
You
that's
know
an
what I'm
opening as well.
saying?
That's
Huh?
an opening. It's an opening to recognize that you're just not in a frame of mind to accept help. And
Yeah. I
that's
mean,
that's a
I said to someone, I was talking with a caregiver yesterday on an email, and they're having some resistance from their parents, and the situation sounded a little, not even a little, but a lot tense and worrisome for the parents as well as the adult children. And I said, sometimes you need to get them in a weak moment. I said, I don't mean for this to sound manipulative, but when we're at our weakest, that's oftentimes when we reach the hand out for help.
Yeah, it
Pull me
sounds
up
like you're
out
saying
of the,
softness, softness.
yeah, pull me up out of the mud. I'm stuck.
Yeah.
I need your hand. I said, maybe this is the weak moment you need to access the kind of information you need to help them with, because you're not helping them now because they won't let you.
Yeah, like it makes me think of the word softening. And there's something in what you do that feels a lot like softening as well. Because one of the things that happens in caregiving, you talk about doing care. Those seem like a lot of the sharp edges, right? It went well, it didn't go well, I did the right thing, I did the wrong thing. They're very binary. Doing has sometimes a quality that feels, because it's so outcomes oriented,
Mm-hmm.
you lose, it gets better, it gets worse. And what happens in all of that doing care, which a lot of caregivers end up doing a lot,
Mm-hmm.
coordinating, mediating, advocating, it's endless for some caregivers, is they naturally, organically lose touch with being care,
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
which is what you felt before the person got sick. I'm in a partnership. I'm being in a caring relationship with someone. There's a sense of mutuality. Let's say the care is flowing. It's less directional and it's more intermingled. And then when you become a caregiver, everything starts feeling very directional. Like the edges get sharper, the cliffs get higher, the consequences get more dire. And everyone is measuring and prodding and poking your experience because that's mostly what you get when you get into things like healthcare. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the this is better, that rate is that this is lower, the
Yeah.
cells are this. It's everything is a unit of measure of your experience. And what you notice, a lot of caregivers are so out of tune with being care.
Mm-hmm.
which is another reason why they tend to self-forget. They forget that they're also in a state of their own care. There's a quality of being care,
Mm-hmm.
right? The sense of I am allowed to be cared for, I'm allowed to care, and that flow gets interrupted. And just that has massive restorative value to have someone in your midst who helps you come back home to care.
Mm-hmm. When I was caring for my mother, I was about 3 years into this, and I burned out. I just was fried
Mm.
because, as I said early on, someone said you're her caregiver, and I went, oh my gosh, well, I better get this right, you know? And that meant even more pressure. And um, one day I went to her assisted living residence and parked the car, and I just broke down sobbing. Just, I don't know where it came from. I just started crying and crying and crying and crying. And I thought to myself, I cannot go in there one more day.
Mm.
I can't do this. I cannot do this again. And I pulled myself together and I walked in. This will make me cry, to her room. And she was sitting in her chair reading. And I got this gorgeous smile. And she opened her arms and she said, I am so happy to see you. Come here and give me a hug. And I was like, okay, I'm going to keep going. And I told myself, I said, but you're going to change some things. You're going to start caring for you, because I had given up so much at that point. And I did. I implemented major changes in how I continued doing what I was doing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
she didn't love them all. But you know what? She was okay.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
did not do her any disservices. I I did not feel guilty if there was if I and one of the things I did was, because I was had her at my house every weekend. I said, no, one weekend's for me. One weekend is mine alone. You know, but
Care is
there
a
were
very,
changes that I had to make, those hard changes in order to care for myself. And when I did that, it opened up such a different experience with her for the last 3.5 years of her life.
yeah. Yeah. Opened up. I mean, care is a very big world. And while it's hard for us to make sense of this, care sometimes means disappointing people.
Mhm.
That's sometimes care looks like that. And you say that and your brain goes, hmm. It's kind of like, that doesn't sound right. Doesn't care like lovey-dovey and super everyone wins and it's happy endings and no, actually. Care is grief, as we've shared. Care is disappointment. Care sometimes is someone fell off a cliff and there was nothing I could do about it. Um, Care is a very big world. And it sounds like because you've been graced with traveling so much of that world, that you would be such a wonderful companion for people in that world, particularly those who feel like they're only living or have to live on one continent in that world.
Mm,
And the world of disappointment is not, I know that's unacceptable, that world to me. Or the world of, I would never think about myself. Like, I don't want to visit the continent of, I want to think about myself. Or I don't want to visit the continent of, it's okay to ask for help. Or like, there's all these features of the world that I don't even, either I don't know exist, or some part of me is cutting myself off from them. And it sounds like when you were in that car, there was a continent that initially you just would not visit, which was, look, it's okay for Robin to be a feature of this thing I call care. Like, it's
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
There is a land called Robin that I can also live in. And when you decided to venture into that land, you actually expanded the field of care. I think that to me is like care is a field. It's a much larger field of possibility, and it includes a lot of things, but it doesn't exclude anything. That's why it's called care. It's not called exclusion, not called exclusioners.
Yeah.
We're caregivers. We are in the craft of moving in this currency we call care. And it's a current. It's flowing. It's expanding at times. It's an ocean of things at times. Sometimes it feels narrow. And I think it's having people like you in this space who open up the field of possibility, who give people a sense of restore in people the sense of the permission to hold care more largely is a massive gift, which is the same reason why I get nervous when it's being crammed into a predetermined box of how we talk about things or how we understand things, particularly care. It's much too wilding for us to believe, even for a moment, that we could ever pin it down, diagnose it, treat it, write the perfect map for it. That to me is an exercise in it's madness. And I would think it would be maddening for caregivers too, because eventually their experience is going to betray the map. That's for sure. For sure, for sure, for sure. They're going to encounter all the things you encountered, all of the wildings of, oh, I'm in the car and I'm feeling this thing called burnout. What's that? I don't have a map for that. But when I allow this in the territory of my experience, when I allow that to be present, then something can actually grow from that.
Yeah, and I think that's another part of it is I grew from my experience, and I'm not really sure how to define that growth. I'd love to do that in this process we're
Yeah,
going to undertake here shortly. But I do believe there is a lot of growth of that you won't experience in other ways in your life
for sure.
because it is such a unique experience to do this. And I think that growth left unexplored, I don't care whether you do anything with it or not. Like I've done with mine, I've felt a drive to do something with it. But I think leaving it unexplored would be a very sad thing for an individual because there's so many layers in there
Yeah.
to explore and see what has this done for me? How has this changed me? How has it affected my thinking and view of the world and other people? What new things have I learned by doing this about myself or skills I may have developed in this process that I didn't dream were skills now, you know? So I think left unexplored is sad. Um,
Yeah.
and perhaps what would be helpful for caregivers along the route would be let's explore what you're learning right now in this particular experience. Now, I'm not a therapist and I have to be really careful because sometimes people think that's what I'm doing and I'm not, you know, but I'm very curious, you know.
Yeah,
And
you're
I
doing
want
everything.
other people to be curious about what's happening and
Yeah,
why and at least explore it. You may not like it and you may want to shut the door on it, and that's okay too, but at least peek
yeah.
behind the door.
It's very hard in an adventure when you bump up against your expectations.
Mhm.
And caregivers are often bumping up against their
Oh
expectations.
yeah, yeah,
And it
yeah.
makes sense because look, I mean, when you expect in your mind, you don't expect, I mean, certainly through a kind of pessimism or cynicism, you might be worried about the future. But if you ask the average person to draw and design their most beautiful life, they become expectant about what that life is going to look like.
Mhm.
And then caregiving says, welcome to your new adventure. And
Yeah.
it looks nothing like that picture. Um, and also life does that because that's why life and care are so interwoven. So it doesn't have to be therapy, but certainly it sounds like you've spent enough time in the territory of your experience to be a very helpful orienteer, someone who helps with orientation to this wilding, adventurous world we call caregiving. Um, and you create a kind of warm invitation to be more in tune with the ecology of their experience. And many of that features of that ecology are completely new.
Well, I think so one of the things I did early on was to look for a support group.
Mm.
And I went to one. And this is no slam against social workers, but they are typically led by social workers and social workers who are not caregivers. And then
Sometimes.
they work at a retirement community because every retirement community, I think, is probably required, or assisted living and nursing homes are required to have them on staff. And they're generally very good at their jobs of facilitating certain conversations. But they are not caregivers, and they're very prescriptive when you are in a support group. And I found that very offensive, so I didn't last very long. And the second thing I did at one point was because this was before I burned out, but I was probably close to it and didn't realize it. I sought out a therapist
Mm.
again, and I've been through therapy. I know what it's like. I thought, oh, a therapist could help me work this out. I was feeling very angry and resentful at my two younger brothers who were doing nothing. And I got a very prescriptive response to that. And I paid the person their $150 or $75. And I walked out of the room and I said, thank you very much. And that was that.
Yeah.
And so I had these two experiences early on in my caregiving years that said to me, these are not the answers. And not that I was, and maybe I was looking for answers at that point, but those weren't the answers. And those weren't what I needed.
Mm.
And I do believe that that's really, some caregivers may find those things useful. And I think one caregiver I worked with had to start caring for her 94-year-old mother who was in amazing shape. But it started in our consultations, it started surfacing some old daughter issues with her mother. And she said to me, I need to go address these things with a therapist. And I said, yes, I agree. I think you probably should, because I can't take you backwards. I can only take you from where you are forwards.
Mm.
But if you need to go backwards, you should go do that. And I do think there's value in that when you're caregiving, because it does bring up, so if you're caring for a parent, bring up so many traumas or dysfunctions from your childhood and your early adult years and so forth, that, and I know have dealt with enough caregivers that end up caring for a parent that they say never loved them.
Yeah.
How do you do that? But they do. And so I do think there's value. I'm not discounting the value in those two routes to take for support. However, I don't really think that encompasses the core of what caregivers are needing when they seek that out, which is a lot of it's validation.
Yeah, it sounds like one thing you're doing for a lot of the caregivers that you're working with is you're helping them become more aware of the territory of their experience. Like just becoming more aware that they're in a state of emotional conflict with their parents,
Mhm.
or that there is something historical in their experience, a trauma or otherwise, that's infiltrating their present moment experience. And to your point, as a referral or as a resource, they can then go seek out maps that address those specific territories. But one of the differences with you and one of the beauties of what you do is the sense of solidarity, that you've really had your feet in the earth of, in the texture and the different landscapes of caregiving. And it's very hard to, it would be unwise to overlook the importance of that. Similarly, like I can go learn meditation from a teacher who knows the steps,
Mm-hmm.
and I can go practice meditation with someone who's been sitting on a pillow for 30 years. They're both important, but they're both important.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't, like, I don't, it would be very difficult for me to imagine learning meditation from someone who hasn't had their ass on a cushion for a long period of time. Because there's something in the experience of that is worlds away from the theory of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of caregiving as well, which is why I think caregivers make the best accompaniers and the best companions in this process, because they've walked a lot of the territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's massive. That's such a gift. Like your attunement to that is a gift to them because they feel like they're in rhythm with you in somewhere that you've been.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, what makes you such a great guide. And
Yeah.
that's another layer of gift that I think that you bring to that experience that sometimes gets unnoticed, as you mentioned, in the world of map making and prescribing and hyper directional solving. That has its place too, but it's different than being in the territory of your experience and being with someone who really has had their ass on the cushion for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
They will explore and show and share things that you just can't learn in a how to meditate video.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're struggling with the beautiful gift of how to bring your gifts to bear in this world called care. Um, and maybe part of this process of understanding this is you also expanding your own window on how you understand what it means to show up to care for these caregivers,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is also new to you, right? It's new.
Yeah. Oh, it's completely new. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a new language, it's a new continent. Yeah, I had my experience, but showing up for the others is a whole new thing. And it makes me think I know a lot of other caregivers that have gone into this field as I have, doing what I do. And I would say a large number of them write a book. 21 things not to do if you're a caregiver, or 12 principles to follow if you're a caregiver that will make it sustainable, and I don't know, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And somebody asked me one time, said, "Are you going to write a book?" And I said, "No." I said, "There are enough books out there. There are
Yeah.
plenty of books. I don't need to write another one of those books." Now, I said, the book I might write is the story of caring for my mother. It might be a memoir that I write the story of actually my whole relationship with my mother, which was disastrous at one point in my life. And I said, maybe that's the book that I write, because I think that for me would be cathartic, but more so than writing somebody, here's the 12 things you should do or not do. But that might be the experience someone needs to hear, that, there was a time in my life where I did not have a relationship with my mother at all, for reasons I won't go into, but I essentially estranged myself from my parents for a number of years.
Yeah.
And it was because of therapy that I was able to renew a relationship with them. and care for my mother. But I couldn't have done that otherwise. And maybe that's the story someone else needs to hear, because there are so many daughters, I think, that struggle with their mothers. And they're the ones that say, well, she never loved me, you know, but now I'm stuck caring for her.
Yeah, like you, I think every caregiver is carrying around a story of care in their
Yeah,
heart.
yeah, yeah,
And that story sometimes is liberating, and sometimes that story is feels suffocating.
hmm,
Um, and there's something important in becoming attuned to that story. And we learn through each other's stories. So your story would have enormous value for other people who see themselves in the mythology of your life. Um, it's actually one of the reasons why in the Growing Through What You Go Through program that we're starting in May with story as the first
yeah,
lens that we're exploring, because there's something about, and Scott is actually facilitating that
right.
first experience. What's the story of care? What's the story of care that I am authoring in my experience? And like, what are the chapters of that story? You
Yeah,
know, like chapter one, I resent my husband.
yeah,
That could be chapter one of your story.
yeah,
Um, and of course, you're living out that story.
yeah, yeah,
And what is it? What would it feel like to like have a bunch of blank pages where you could actually start authoring new stories? Authoring, like when you were sitting in that car, you could have either gone to chapter two and been like, okay, I know chapter two. Chapter two is I go in and I do the thing that I need to do for mom. I mean, you know that story.
mhm,
You had lived that story 1,000 times before that. And something in you said, wait a second, if it is a story, it means there's pages. And if there's pages, it means that some of them can be blank. And I can actually start writing a new story.
mm,
Like I have that capacity. The same way I wrote the story that led to this moment.
mhm,
Because that's what you did. You wrote the story of your life, of how you understood care, and that's where you were in that moment. Like literally, I could have flipped back the pages
mhm,
of Robin's life, and it would have made perfect sense how you kind of ended up in the moment in that car. And then some part of you said, no, there are blank pages in this book. It's called My Present Moment and My Future, and I can start authoring all kinds of new things. And I think that's also the story of care. The story of care is that because it is this vast ocean of possibility, it's also things that we rewrite into our experience.
yeah,
Even at a time where we feel like things are a little out of control, they're a little bit hectic, they're a little bit unsure. Like, how do I write the story of how I experience uncertainty? That's a story. That's a whole thing to write about. Um, and that's where the choice and the freedom comes. Like I can write the story of how I'm going to show up to uncertainty.
mhm,
There's this wonderful story in a book by Hugh Prather, who wrote a really well-known um, book called Notes to Myself, but he wrote many other
oh,
books.
yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
Yeah, he was a parishioner, and he talked about a couple that showed up to him one day in a kind of counseling session. And they had recently received the news that their daughter had been diagnosed with a pretty life-threatening illness. And what was interesting in the way he told the story was that they made a commitment to each other on day one that they would not put their attention on all the things that were happening to their daughter, all the things that would naturally be beyond their control, that's not where they wanted to set their energies. What they would only set their energies as on was the sense of being caring,
mm,
because that was something they could always orient to.
mhm,
So whether they saw a nurse and the nurse said the wrong thing, or they saw the doctor and the doctor gave them terrible news, or they called the local home care and they couldn't come for 3 weeks, those were all the things that were kind of up in the air. All the uncertain things that they knew would just be a feature of this experience. But care, they could always come home to. No one could take care away from them.
Mm-hmm.
No one could misdiagnose, misrefer,
Mm-hmm.
delay care. That's a really powerful example of writing your future in a way that sets you on a caring path.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we start with story. I hope that the growing through what you go through experience will be opening in some of these questions that are percolating in your heart and mind around how do I want to show up in this new experience of caring for caregivers? And my sense is that a lot of the lenses that we're exploring, story and time and presence and lightheartedness and beauty and love will be ways in which that you could see differently into that question.
Yeah.
So that'll be exciting, an exciting adventure. And for any of the caregivers listening to this who get to connect with people like you and find solidarity in that experience through this, because fellowship is a big part of this adventure. Like we travel together, we travel well together.
Mm-hmm.
And then who also have these kinds of questions showing up in their experience. How do I deal with this uncertainty? How do I mitigate my own feelings while I'm dealing with a loved one? How do I navigate this world of called healthcare, whatever it is, whatever other things are showing up in your process? I really appreciate today. I appreciate the courage that it takes to go back into your own experience and make that a feature of what you're willing to learn through and to explore through, because it would seem like maybe the natural tendency would say, I've been there, done that, and I know how things should be.
Well, and that's what I don't want to do. That's why there's this sort of, it's not a struggle, it's not a conflict, it's a questioning.
Yeah, it's a process. It's a process. You're in a new process.
Yeah.
And I think that growing through what you go through was in some ways architected for people who notice that they're in a process. If you have all the answers, you won't love growing through what you go through. If you got the 10-step program and that's all you want to know, you probably won't love growing through what you go through. Growing through what you go through is it is a wilding, walkabouty kind of experience. We found the word Codywomple. Have you heard the word Codywomple?
No.
Codywomple is loosely translated as meandering purposefully.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, okay.
It's kind of a sense that one is moving purposefully, but in a kind of in a world that is wilding, or in a world that is also meandering.
Yeah.
And that's often what caregiving feels like.
Yeah.
You have something in your heart that you want to move towards, and yet you also notice that there is this meandering, this kind of wilding.
Yeah.
And how do you hold those two things?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for this, Robin. I really appreciate you sharing so open-heartedly.
Thank you. This conversation has been so rich. I just have loved it, Mark. It's just really filled me up. Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you. So we have this readying session on April 30th.
Right.
For people who kind of want to get to know what is this about, and we're gonna kind of it's gonna be less informational, although there'll be some information, but a bit more exploratory.
Okay.
And then the first experience around story begins on May 6th.
Okay. Yep. They're on my calendar. Yeah.
Great.
I'm looking forward to it.
It was lovely seeing you.
You too. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the week.
You too. I'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye.